Why vulnerability feels dangerous to scapegoat survivors. Well, if you grew up as the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent, then being vulnerable with your thoughts and feelings is anything but safe. What you likely learned in such a household is that anything you do feel or think can and will be used against you. The lesson the scapegoat child learns again and again is that when they honestly share a part of what they think or feel, they're in essence handing their narcissistic parent a weapon instead of just sharing a part of who they actually are. When that's the lesson over and over in childhood, it's no wonder that adult scapegoat survivors might find it similarly dangerous to be honest with their own thoughts and feelings in relationships and friendships today. Well, in today's video, I'm going to explain what, first of all, I mean by vulnerability. Second, I'll offer some explanations as to why a narcissistic parent responds so negatively to a child's vulnerability. Third, I'm going to cover some common solutions that scapegoat survivors may try, but ultimately don't seem to move the needle. And fourth, I'm going to explain what truly works for scapegoat survivors to learn in their bones that it is now safe to be vulnerable when needed. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I've worked for many years with scapegoat survivors in individual therapy and in group settings. And in the course of this work, a common phenomenon is that when scapegoat survivors try to be open with the people they ostensibly find to be safe, their mind braces and their body tenses, and there's a very strong inner conviction that the other person's going to mock, criticize, or ridicule them. In essence, turn what they're about to share against them. And this reaction comes directly from what vulnerability meant in childhood. And to put this video in a broader context of what's needed to really recover from this form of narcissistic abuse for scapegoat survivors, I want to introduce you to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 is to make sense of what happened in the course of the abuse so that you can ultimately know it was not your fault. Pillar number 2 is to gain distance from narcissistically abusive people today and closeness to safe people. And pillar number 3 is to live in defiance of the narcissist rules. Today's video actually falls under 2 pillars, and that is making sense of what happened, pillar number 1, and living in defiance of the narcissist rules, pillar number 3. And quickly, I want to just let you know about a free resource that can show you how and why a child gets scapegoated by a narcissistic parent, what the child has to do to survive, and what recovery can look like. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as a Scapegoat. You can find the link in the description box below or by clicking here. So what does it mean to be vulnerable? Well, I think of vulnerability as expressing yourself in ways that count on the other person showing kindness, compassion, and respect for what you have to say, but at the same time, there is an opportunity for this person to use this information against you via mockery, breaking your confidentiality by talking about you to other people, and or pathologizing you. And by pathologizing, I just mean reacting as though there's something wrong with you. And here are 6 forms that vulnerability can take. First is showing your real emotional state. And this can take the form of letting someone else actually see when you feel sad, afraid, confused, hurt, maybe joyous too, instead of masking it or shutting it down. Second is sharing what things actually mean to you. So not just recounting events that have happened, but talking about what your internal reactions to those events have been. Another form of vulnerability are dropping habitual protection strategies. So that can mean setting aside things like perfectionism, sarcasm, emotional distancing, over-explaining, or caretaking long enough for your real thoughts and feelings to emerge. Another very important form of vulnerability, especially for scapegoat survivors, is showing a willingness to receive. This means letting someone else respond to you with care, curiosity, and support instead of pushing it away. And the 6th form of vulnerability is staying present with what can be uncomfortable. And sort of simply put, that just means staying grounded in yourself when such states emerge instead of shutting down or going numb. And I really want to emphasize that these forms of vulnerability, I no mean want to be sort of taken as a admonishment for when you sort of have to enact some of these protective strategies that kind of interfere with vulnerability, because forced vulnerability or sort of admonishing oneself to be vulnerable, because to not be vulnerable is letting sort of the narcissistic parent win or surrendering to the trauma, I think is, unfortunately it does happen, but I think it can do sort of more harm than good, because it's sort of taking kind of an attacking posture towards oneself, albeit under the auspices of this is for my own good, let's say, if I'm treating myself this way, but it kind of reinstantiates that kind of like finger wagging stance towards oneself that, of course, scapegoat children and survivors have had more than their share of. And so the less that can happen, I think the better. So with all that said, if you notice any ways in which, from the list I just described, that it can be very hard to access vulnerable states with others, that's okay too. And the process I'm going to describe today about growing to find it safe to be vulnerable does not happen in one fell swoop. So the more kindness and compassion and patience you can afford yourself, I think that's going to provide a lot of benefits, not just because it hews closer to how the process works, but also because offering yourself those sorts of gifts of like patience and compassion are in themselves antidotal to the kind of like devaluing and disrespectful treatment typically received from a narcissistic parent. In essence, this is all about recovering from. So when someone does respond in a positive way to your vulnerability, the rewards are that you get to feel understood, like your thoughts and feelings matter to someone else, and that the knowledge of when you share those honest thoughts and feelings, that someone responds in a protective manner, not in a sort of exploitative or harmful way. And of course, on the flip side, the risk of then being vulnerable is that they don't respond in these ways, and instead you're left feeling used and humiliated. Kids with good enough parents got the reward outcomes pretty regularly, so they would expect that later on in adulthood. And of course, the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent got that negative outcome over and again. So of course, today, it's going to feel quite dangerous to be vulnerable with people. Well, now I'd like to talk about 4 reasons why a narcissistic parent responds so poorly to a scapegoat child's vulnerability. First, the scapegoat child's vulnerability can remind the narcissistic parent in a kind of procedural memory type of way of the parent's own vulnerability and likely the shame that a narcissistic parent has about their vulnerability in this respect. Most people who suffer from narcissistic personality disorder find it extremely shame-provoking to understand what their actual needs are, let alone express them to others. So if they are the parent to a child who's very upfront, the child is upfront with their needs, that can put the parent directly in touch with their own shame of their own needs and become something that they want to repudiate the child for showing. The second reason why a narcissistic parent may react negatively to their scapegoat child's vulnerability is that because narcissistic individuals tend to see everything that happens in their lives as a reflection of them, then if the child's in need, a narcissistic parent, especially one who has to see themselves as a perfect parent, could perceive the child's expressed vulnerability as, in essence, saying that the parent's not doing enough for the child. And that can evoke, again, maybe a quick sense of the parent's own sense of worthlessness, but quickly kind of get overridden with the parent's defensive rage and trying to punish the threat to their kind of very fragile self-esteem that the vulnerable scapegoat child is, supposedly posing. And the third reason why a narcissistic parent can react negatively to a scapegoat child is that, in such a family, there can be such a culture of devaluing, depriving, and domineering the scapegoat child that when the child does have a moment of vulnerability, the narcissistic parent can just sort of seize on that as another opportunity to show the child why they are inferior and the parent is superior. In this case, because the parent supposedly has no needs and the child does have a need because the child's expressing it. And fourth, when a child or anyone shows a vulnerability, there's an implicit emotional request to the other, namely to show attention, protectiveness, and some sort of attuned responsiveness. Well, a narcissistic parent needs to see themselves as sort of the most important person whose thoughts and feelings demand others' attention. And they can feel deeply offended when their child sort of looks to them with sort of a vulnerability, with this implicit request for the parent's attention, because the parent can see the child is trying to take away what the parent believes they're entitled to. Namely, that in essence, it's the child who should be paying all their attention towards the parent. So with such a parent so engineered to respond poorly to their scapegoat child's vulnerability, what are the impacts on that child? I want to start with shame. When the scapegoat child starts in a moment of vulnerability where they just want to share what's on the inside of them in hopes and expectation that they'll be met with a sort of kindness and attuned responsiveness, but instead are mocked or derided, something very important happens there that results in shame. In essence, you can think of it, this is the child, they're kind of coming in with this vulnerability, and this is the parent hoping there's sort of going to be they call it a moment of meeting. The parent's going to attunely respond here. And that can look like, oh, what is it? Oh, that sounds so hard. And, validation and compassion. When a narcissistic parent is threatened by the child's vulnerability for, say, one of those 4 reasons, what they will typically do is, instead of trying to see the subjective experience of the child, they're kind of going to break that connection and see the child as now an object. I'll crumble up my fist now like an object. And now, instead of let's do an example with this. Let's say the child comes and says, "I'm sad, Mom." Mom's a narcissistic parent. Instead of the mother saying, "Oh, what is it, honey? What's making you sad?" And that would be sort of a good enough attuned response, and that both parties would stay in their subjectivity, and shame would not be involved. But if the mother here is narcissistic and says something like, "Oh, you must have low self-esteem and depression. People can tell if you get depressed, and they don't want to be around people like that." Well, now the child is like this sad guy, or in this case, let's say it's her son, a sad guy, not someone who needs to be met right here. And when this happens, it's sort of, there's this profound sense of difference that the child, in this case, feels with the other. Because they expected to be met as a subject, now by that very same person, they're being treated and regarded as an object. So there's this gap, this break in the connection between them that is excruciating. And that's when our emotion of shame really kind of floods us. Another impact on the scapegoat child is that they feel profoundly betrayed. And I would add, this is a betrayal of sort of the highest order, I think. Because, kids are born to their parents expecting to find compassion, respect, and protectiveness. But instead, they find the opposite from that very same person they're expecting to find those good things from. And that's sort of the natural order. So the scapegoat child's is getting betrayed by sort of what, the natural order says should be the person who's kind of most in their corner. And this can have a profound detrimental impact on the scapegoat child's ability to trust others. Because, of course, there's no one they can really tell to say, like another protective adult, that, oh, my parent is betraying me almost at every turn. They can't think those kinds of thoughts. A child can't, because they depend on the parent too much at that stage of life. So it can result in kind of having to withdraw from sort of everybody in a fundamental, deep way, because the child learns that nobody truly has their back. Everyone's going to turn on them or against them and away from them at one point or another, just like their parent has shown them time and again. So how does the child adapt? Well, they have to shut off parts of themselves that could lead to vulnerable expressions. This can mean turning their feelings off and living in a sort of flat and colorless way internally. Or sometimes a narcissistic parent may demand, explicitly or implicitly, in a coercive way, or in a coercive way, that the scapegoat child shows vulnerability all the time, like a coercive vulnerability mandate. And when a narcissistic parent treats the scapegoat child in this manner, it's not so that they can kind of connect with the child and help the child feel like they're understood in their moments of vulnerability. It's rather to send the message that the child is weak for being so vulnerable, and by contrast, the parent is so much stronger. So the scapegoat child and survivor may then veer away from vulnerability later, because doing so feels like they're just setting themselves up to be exploited, so that someone else can regard them as weak or less than, and they can prop themselves up by feeling better than or stronger. And the third impact it can have on the scapegoat child is developing the unconscious belief about themselves that there's something wrong with them. That is, that they're defective. And such a belief about themselves actually prevents them from showing vulnerability, because the logic goes something like, if there's something fundamentally wrong with me, then if I show other people what's true about me on the inside, then all I'm going to do is show more people that there's something wrong with me. So no thanks, I'm going to stay away from that. Taken together, of course, you can see how this leads to such a tragically alone and isolated inner existence for the scapegoat child. And this is editorial, but I just want to underscore that it takes tremendous strength and determination, and I think grit, to just persist through such isolation, and get to a point where maybe it's possible to begin to address some of these wounds. Well, these impacts certainly have impacts later in life for scapegoat survivors. It can feel very dangerous to get and sustain closeness to others, and the earlier breeding of mistrust due to their narcissistic parents' near constant betrayal of them can make it so that new situations today where they're being invited to trust another, can feel like walking on very, very thin, like balsa wood over like a snake pit. Yeah, very scary. Well, here's 4 things that scapegoat survivors may try to kind of recover their right to be vulnerable as needed, but typically have not worked. First is opening up to people who can't or won't understand narcissistic abuse. So particularly at the early stages of recovery from this form of abuse, a scapegoat survivor may kind of begin to realize that the way I was raised was not how everyone else was raised, and the story I told myself and others about having a good family, a good parent, was actually not true. And now that I'm seeing what really was, I want to share this with people. And sometimes, many times, when a survivor shares how things really were with, say, a longtime friend or partner or family friend, they may encounter people saying things like, oh, all parents have their bad days, or I think you're overreacting, or that's not what I saw, so I don't really know what to tell you, or even something like, well, okay, so what do you want from me? These can be, of course, very painful reactions, and really reinforce the earlier lessons that nothing good happens from being vulnerable. But I do want to say that as recovery kind of progresses, it can be more possible to identify who might respond in a more kind of positive and caring way, and who won't, or who's likely not to. The second way that survivors may try to recover the right to be vulnerable is by forcing themselves to be more vulnerable than they feel safe to be. They may get frustrated with their own protective strategies and kind of force themselves to kind of run headlong into kind of moments of vulnerability with people in their lives, but like their nervous system or something keeps saying, no, don't do this. And as a result, although they're kind of doing the act of being sort of vulnerable with folks, their nervous system is on too high alert, feels too endangered for the survivor to take in the new information that maybe people are responding better than their narcissistic parent did in the past. And again, so as a result, it becomes very hard to learn that things are different now when they're vulnerable. They may still, force themselves to be vulnerable, yet it remains, it still feels dangerous because their nervous system is on such high alert. But when such vulnerability happens in kind of gradual incremental doses, that this kind of problem can get resolved. And I'll talk more about that in a few moments. The third thing that's often done is trying to think one's way into feeling safe with being vulnerable. Finding out that it's safe to be vulnerable needs experience with others to be truly believed. Sometimes scapegoat survivors may analyze in their own mind, maybe journal at length, and kind of like tell themselves that they should be able to open up, and yet just still not feel safe enough to do so. And this is because the depth of the imprint that vulnerability is dangerous just happens at a deeper level than pure thought. And fourth is trying to heal the fear of vulnerability through isolation. So there can be a pull to withdraw and rely on kind of like lone wolf strategies. These can include staying quiet, keeping everything inside, avoiding emotional conversations, or waiting to feel better before connecting with others. And such strategies do afford temporary relief, but reinforce the idea that vulnerability is unsafe and connection with others is optional instead of very much needed. Well, what I've shared so far are kind of the broad strokes of what makes it hard to be vulnerable for scapegoat survivors. But a really powerful addition to this would be to hear from you. And so I would pose the question, what do you find most challenging when it comes to being vulnerable from others? And I invite you to share your answer in the comments section below. By building up a bunch of examples in the comments section of how this fear of vulnerability shows up in scapegoat survivors' lives, especially specific examples, I think it can go a long way towards helping people see that they're not alone in having this experience. So what does work to overcome the fear of vulnerability for scapegoat survivors? And I'll put forward two things. First are new experiences with other people that contradict the old association between being vulnerable and being humiliated. Second is having a collaborative association with another person who can help you notice how your mind adapted to that old association of vulnerability and others' cruelty. In such a collaboration with another person, you get to see how to interrupt those kind of habits of mind that might otherwise prevent you from seeing what happens today when you're vulnerable with safe people. Namely, that others come safely closer to you instead of put you down. Without such a collaborative understanding with another person, the adaptations made to survive the old association between vulnerability and cruelty could be or stay so entrenched in your mind that it makes it hard to take in the new information today. Both are needed to know at a very deep level that most people today don't react the way your narcissistic parent did, and that your fear of vulnerability did not come from nowhere, but rather came from adapting to really, really abusive circumstances back then, but are no longer present today. And this last part about recognizing that today is different from the past is kind of the essence of recovering from any form of trauma, but certainly the trauma of narcissistic abuse. So where can you get these? Well, both of these healing strategies require connection to others. For scapegoat survivors who've learned that in essence connection with others is dangerous, it can be important to have kind of scaffolding around re-entering relational situations that help you feel as safe as possible. And there are two such forms of scaffolding that I'll mention. First is therapy. I don't think there's a better way to gain an understanding with another, which would require another person's connection, of how your past adaptations that work to help you survive a world where being vulnerable was very dangerous get in the way today of seeing where and when that's no longer true. And the second sort of scaffolding relational arrangement that can be very helpful for overcoming this fear of vulnerability is in a group work. In conjunction with therapy, this can give you the actual experiences of being with others and not just a therapist who respond to your chosen moments of vulnerably sharing with compassion, respect, and protectiveness of your feelings. And I do want to mention one way to get this type of experience in a group setting. It's an 8-week live online group class called Breaking the Scapegoat Spell that I lead and facilitate. Over the course of 8 75-minute classes, you'll get instruction and mind-body tools, how you may have learned to forbid yourself to be vulnerable in order to spare yourself the humiliation that you learned would always occur in childhood. Then you'll apply these lessons and tools in individual exercises that you do in the class itself, followed by getting together with a partner who's carefully selected to be a good fit with you, where you will then share what you've done in the individual exercise. You'll be with the same partner for the entire 8 weeks, which allows a sense of familiarity and trust to develop. Participants in the group so far have mentioned how getting to share their actual experience and thoughts and feelings with their partner who does truly get where they're coming from has helped them realize that accessing and sharing their vulnerabilities no longer has to mean compromising their dignity. As a result, participants have described feeling a lot more whole. And the course is designed for such experience in the partner work to be springboards for finding similar experiences in your life outside the class. And I want to recognize that it can be a little anxiety provoking to join a group. If your experience with others has been that it doesn't go well, that people will be rejecting or mocking and so forth, like we've talked about today. But I do believe, and I've witnessed, that when folks can take that risk, that the rewards far outweigh that initial anxiety. Well, I hope you found today's video helpful if you also can kind of connect with this fear of vulnerability as a scapegoat survivor. And here's another video that you might be interested in because it goes into a lot more depth about what I talked a bit earlier about where a narcissistic parent may sort of insist the child be kind of overly vulnerable, not to get a sense of how the child's feeling, but more to, make the child feel and seem weak relative to the supposedly strong, completely invulnerable parent. And with that, I want to thank everyone for your continued support of this channel and the resources around it. If you haven't seen it already, I recommend if you go to the YouTube Live section on this channel. Last week's free webinar on escaping the upside down world of the scapegoat survivor was a great, I thought, success, and I felt really grateful for the attendance and participation. And with that, I look forward to posting again next week. Take care.